and welcome to Note Doctors. My name is Paul.
My name is Jen.
My name is Ben.
And we are your hosts. We are all university music theory instructors who are passionate about music theory and music theory instruction. In this podcast, we will be talking about all things theory with some of the best music theory teachers in the country. If you want to know more about music theory and the most effective and innovative ways to teach it, this is the podcast for you. Welcome to Season 2 of Note Doctors. Thank you so much for joining us for this new season of music theory and music theory pedagogy nerding out. We have some great guests lined up for you, and we're really excited about the things that they're going to be sharing with us and with all of you. First, before we get into our first guest, we do want to mention that you can find us on the internet. We're out there beyond just the podcast. We're on Facebook, facebook.com/Note Doctors Podcast. We're also on Instagram, right? Is that right? And
that is true.
Yes. And you can DM us, right?
That's right.
Is that how I say that?
Yes.
At Note Doctors Podcast. I got to get the lingo correct. And if you have any comments, because we love hearing from our listeners. In fact, we had a comment over the summer from Luzanne, who teaches and is a graduate student in South Africa. So thank you, Luzanne, for commenting and writing to us. She says that she enjoys the podcast so much that she's listening to each of the episodes more than once. That's dedication right there.
I am not exaggerating when I say that email made my year. It was so encouraging. I loved it.
We love you.
We do.
Yes, so thank you so much, Luzanne. And if you have any comments or ideas for future topics or guests that you'd like us to have on the show, please reach out to us. You can leave us
you can
reviews
DM
on
us.
iTunes. You can DM us on Instagram. Only good reviews on iTunes, please, we ask. So as we kick off Season 2, we have a very exciting first guest, I think, don't we? Is that right, Jen?
That is right. So our guest today is Cory Arnold. Cory Arnold is a professional elephant cartoonist and occasional music theorist who's been publishing song analyses and other videos on music theory for 6 years on their YouTube channel, 12 Tone. They also co-host the podcast Ghost Notes, where they do deep dives on various musical questions. And we had an absolutely fun and delightful conversation with Cory. So stay tuned.
In my work, I didn't want to show my face, and so I had to figure out other ways to make it feel like it was just like a friend explaining a thing to you, and that doodling style is a way to sort of feel like you're, to me it immediately evokes like sitting in the back of a class you're not paying that much attention to and just messing around. And I think most people have at some point in their life not paid attention in class, and so that I think gives it, and again, it sort of removes some of the, for lack of a better word, stuffiness of it too. It makes it feel like it's sort of like an unspoken, like, look, I get it. Like, this may not seem like the most exciting thing, but trust me, I think it's really cool and you should listen to me. As opposed to like trying to be like really like, oh, you should care about this thing. It just has this subtlety to it that shows rather than tells that like, I acknowledge that maybe you might not think you care, but you should care.
So today, our very special guest is none other than Cory Arnold. You might be wondering, who is Cory Arnold? Well, you might know Cory Arnold better as 12 Tone, the YouTuber, and we are so thrilled to have you on our podcast and to talk with you about your work and all the things that go into that. Before, though, we would like to just kind of get a little background information. I actually, when I reached out to you, I think wrote like, Dear Mr. 12 Tone or something like that. I wasn't even sure who you were. And so tell us a little bit about, how you got into music theory, a little bit about your musical background. I'm guessing that it's just a love affair of Arnold Schoenberg and Second Viennese composition, but maybe that's wrong.
No, so I sort of got into music in high school, and my initial plan was to be a metal singer. Like that was my goal. And I went to college to be a metal singer, and found out pretty quickly that being a professional musician is actually very hard. So I decided to like sort of look into teaching as an option, and so I'd switched to go get a full bachelor's instead of the associates I'd been getting. And that was, I think, sort of, I'd always liked theory, mainly because it was a class I was good at. Like, I found that I was good at thinking about structures and systems in the way that my like theory classes wanted me to. And so like, but it was in sort of late into like bachelor theory that like I really started to recognize how much I actually liked it as an idea. I think the thing that I always cite as sort of the idea that turned me on to music theory as a thing I might want to do is diminished seventh modulations, which sounds very specific and niche, but it's, I guess it was just the way I've described it in the past in some contexts is like, I think of a lot of these things as almost like conceptual structure, conceptual sculpture rather, and diminished seventh modulations were the first time I'd really seen and understood the beauty of like a completed piece, you know, if that makes any sense outside of my head. I don't know if it does, but that was sort of the thing where I was like, I still remember the lesson where they were just, my teacher was walking through this thing where it's like, oh, you can go to these 4 keys. And it's like, oh, that's cool. And then it's like, oh, but if you treat it as like 7 diminished 7 of 5, then you can go to these other 4 keys. And it's so quickly and going. And I was like, oh, but if it's of 4, then that's whoa, that's all 12 keys. And like, and that sort of was, I don't know that was the moment that I was like, oh, I'm definitely going to do this for the rest of my life. But that was sort of the moment that started to grow as a possibility. It was like, oh, this is something I want to do. This is something that's honestly more interesting to me and than actually being a gigging, performing musician professionally. Mm-hmm.
That's so interesting you talk about it being sculptural, because I like to teach those modulations with a clock face. And so you draw your pitches for your fully diminished 7 starting on C, and you realize it's symmetrical. And then,
you have this little diamond.
It's a little diamond, and then you can just spin the diamond around, and you can modulate pretty much anywhere. So you go from fully diminished 7th modulations to creating a YouTube channel about theory. Talk about those steps.
So the sort of, in college, I started watching some of the early sort of YouTube education channels. Like, this is something that I've done some research on, and that sort of like traces back to around 2008-ish is when these started popping up, as far as I could find. And around like 2010 or whatever, I started really getting into those. And I was talking with a friend of mine who'd introduced me to the channel Number File. I don't know if you're familiar. They do math videos, and were like made by Brady Heron, who was like one of the earliest people in like the YouTube education scene. And a friend of mine had shown me his math channel, and I was like really into it. And I was talking to my friend, and he was actually like, oh, I was considering starting a YouTube channel, but I don't know what it would be about. And I was just sort of like offhanded, casually, like, you know, I've been doing pretty well in my theory classes. I could probably do something about that if I wanted to. And then, but at the time, my goal was still to be a teacher and like in person doing classes. And I was sort of trying to angle myself to get a job at the school I'd been going to once I graduated. And then that sort of fell through. That didn't happen. And so I found myself with a bunch of free time, and I had completely failed to make a backup plan. So I was like, okay, well, I tried to get a couple bands going, but like it was really hard to organize people to do something like that. And I'm not good at organizing people. So I was just like, I had this other idea too, and I had plenty of time to do it. So I just sort of started reached out to some friends to try and put it together, and started making stuff about mostly like the undergrad theory stuff that I already knew. A lot of the other stuff I did came later, but yeah.
So probably when you went through your undergrad theory instruction, maybe your teacher didn't use that many pop music examples, but a lot of your videos showcase lots of different styles of popular music. When did you get into analyzing popular music and looking at it in this unique way?
So that came pretty naturally once the idea of analyzing music at all started like occurring in the channel, because like I'm not a huge fan of a lot of the canon. Like no disrespect to any of that, or to anyone who likes listening to Beethoven, Bach, Mozart. Like, that's fine, but it's not really the music that I grew up with. It's not the music that I love. It's not the music that moves me. And so it was actually like, I think like a year and a half into the channel, maybe 2 years, Leonard Cohen passed away. And my dad reached out and was like, hey, it might be interesting to make a video about Hallelujah, you know, his biggest song, because it literally describes its chord progression in the first verse. And so it was like, okay, well, but what is like a minor fall? What is a major lift? And I had to be like, okay, those aren't, you know, technical terms, but, you know, you still have that, like, that clear explanation of what the music is doing while it's doing it that is really interesting. And so we did a video about that. And at the time, my sibling was proofreading all my scripts, and I ran this by them, and they were like, hey, this is probably the most interesting thing you've ever written to me, because it grounds a lot of these ideas and makes it more accessible, because I understand the song. I can take this thing you're talking about and apply it to sounds that I can relate to, as opposed to, you know, if I'm just talking about like the Tonettes or whatever. Like, I love talking about the Tonettes, but most people don't have a good intuitive understanding of like neo-Riemannian spaces.
Right.
So weirdly, but
Shocker.
but it was just a way to take at least some of these ideas, at least the ones that applied to works that I wanted to talk about, and make them more relatable. And once I started doing that, it wasn't long before the channel started getting a lot more attention than it had been previously.
Yeah, it's amazing when you start connecting the concepts to real music that people live with, and the connections that actually happen, right?
Yeah. And it's one of those things where, like, I'm a little ambivalent about it, because, again, I do really like thinking about these things in their really abstract senses as well. Like, you know, the first couple things I mentioned in this episode were like the diminished seventh modulation and the Tonettes, and neither of those are that relevant to most of the music that I listen. There are some songs I listen to where I could make neo-Riemannian arguments, but like as a whole, it's not the most relevant stuff. But it is, I think, really conceptually beautiful in ways that I think are worth appreciating and worth acknowledging outside of their application. But also, it is really useful to like take a song and be like, here, this is a song, and let's see. It's not so much that I'm grabbing a song that I think is a particularly good example of a concept and then trying to use that song to demonstrate that most of the time. It's more taking a song that I like and being like, okay, so what's happening, you know?
Oh, I love that. Yeah, and I noticed even some of the titles of your videos like start with a why question, which is kind of like, I like to frame classes like that. Like, I'll just start this semester, a couple classes I've already done, with just a tune, and I'll say, pick a moment, and why does it sound that way? And I think you've kind of framed your videos like that, like why those four chords are everywhere, for example, you know? Like, starting it with that question, people are like, oh, well, why, you know, why is it? Like, why does it sound that way? And like, why those four chords? Exactly. Like, those kind of questions are really enticing, I think, versus just saying like, hey, so who wants to learn about the Tonettes, you know? It's like, oh, no clicks, but like, why are those four chords? 70,000 views, you know? It's kind of interesting, you know?
Yeah, there's this, like, one of the biggest pieces of advice, like, in terms of like title writing for videos that I always give, is like, if you can, the best title is a question that someone never thought to ask, right? Like something where they go like, oh yeah, what is that? Why is that? What's going on? But
I love that
until you actually put the idea in front of them, they don't see it. And obviously, like, some things work better than others in that approach, and so not all of my videos do that. But like, if I can kind of, like, one of my like favorite titles like I've ever done, which is on a video that like I'm not super proud of anymore. Like, it's not that it was a bad video. It's just like, you know, it was fairly early on, and so like I could do much better today. But it was just like, why don't all instruments sound the same? And like, you know, it's a great sort of way to introduce like concepts of like the harmonic series and timbre and stuff like that.
Yep.
And, you know, again, like, the video itself, pretty basic in terms of information. It's not like I would recommend everyone go watch that right now. I've done much better videos about timbre and harmonic series and stuff. But, you know, it is that sort of thing where you hear it and go like, wait, why not?
Right.
Like, why would that be?
That is great. And so talk us a little bit about the process of going through making a video. So where do you come up with the ideas? How long is the process of script writing, videoing it, drawing, editing, and what kind of technology do you use for? I'm sure some people would be curious about kind of the behind the scenes workings.
Yeah, so the process actually kind of just changed. I made some adjustments to my schedule recently to give myself more time for research and script writing and stuff. But broadly, to start at the beginning of that, like where do ideas come from? It's a mix of things. When I do a song analysis, what I'll do is I run a poll on my Patreon page. And so every month people will vote. I'll give them like 4 songs and carry songs that do sort of well but don't win through to the next one, just so I have to come up with fewer songs. But like I'll present 4 options and people will vote, and then the song analysis is whichever one of those wins. And I'm mostly like I used to sort of look up like chord progressions or whatever, look up a little bit of transcription just to make sure there was something to say. But these days I'm just like confident that if I love a song enough to put it on that list, I'll find something. There's always something, and I just have to know how to look for it. And so I've really at this point just picked songs and don't even start like examining them really until I know which one won. But like the other things I do that are like the non-song analysis stuff, that varies. Some of that is from, keeping up on literature. I spend a lot of time like whenever like a new MTO comes out. I mostly use MTO because it's free. I do look at like Spectrum and like music cognition and whatever as well, but it's just so much easier when it's MTO because I can just look at the whole thing without, having to figure out a way to get access. But
why we charge people for access to that? I don't really know why.
Right.
It's weird. I don't know. It's just because SMT publishes like Spectrum and MTO, and it just I don't know.
Right.
But I don't know. That's not super, my point here. But keeping up on literature, finding things that I want to read, like the video I did last week, as of this recording, was basically it was a video about choruses, because I assume this will take a while to come out, so people know what I'm talking about. But that was basically me reading an article and then most of a dissertation by a guy called Trevor de Klerk about song form and sort of spinning off from that. And like again, a lot of that does come from just me looking at articles, seeing what they reference, going and reading that, and trying to read as much as I can. The other main source of topics is getting mad about things on Twitter.
It's a great source. It's a lot of my videos come from, or not a lot, but a good portion of my videos come from me just like seeing something, either because like music Twitter as a whole got mad about it, or because like I saw an article. It was just like, I don't know, like for instance the Ben Shapiro thing. I'm sure I don't have to provide too much additional context for that. But
we're having his father on next time because he did go to music school and study music theory.
There was a whole I had a whole meltdown on Twitter about that specific my music theory father who went to music school. I spent like days just like freaking out about this. Like Adam Neely and I like tried our hardest to figure out where he went to music school, like if he had ever actually worked as a music theorist. It was a lot, but that's often like a little less glibly than just getting mad at things on Twitter. Like that is often like I'll become aware of things on Twitter, become aware of conversations that are happening, become aware of like either conversations about things that like are maddening or conversations about things that are interesting. And I'll also like connect with people, and sometimes they'll post about their research, and that'll be another way to find things. So it really largely just comes from trying to stay on top of and be aware of what's happening in music theory literature. And then also, again, often it will come down to just like having a question and trying to find out like what is the whole thing about this. Like the video I did, like it was a couple of years ago now, but about the sharpness wars. That whole thing was like, I had read about it at one point, but I was pretty sure I'd read about it on Wikipedia, so I didn't trust it, and I couldn't find any other sources. And then I was just like reading a completely unrelated book. It was Ryan North's How to Invent Everything. Great book, by the way. But it just mentioned the term pitch inflation. And suddenly I had a search term, and I went and dug, and I found fell completely down this rabbit hole of just like, what happened? What was this? And suddenly got like a lot of actual scholarly sources that I could cite instead of just like a vague recollection from Wikipedia that I couldn't find the page for anymore, which wasn't super useful. And that's sort of how I wound up digging up the fact that concert A is defined in the Treaty of Versailles, which is ridiculous, but it is. And also, it's not defined as what we currently use it as. Like, Britain started playing like weird math games, and so now it's higher than what the Treaty of Versailles says it's supposed. It's such a great anecdote, and it just comes from having a question and going and digging and seeing what you can find. But that's probably way too long of an answer for like the first third of a question.
No, but that's
a great
totally
answer.
fine.
Yeah, that's really great to see because, it's showing the diligence that you're putting into these videos and that your work has this kind of serious backbone behind it, right?
Yeah. Yeah, no, there's a lot of research that goes into this. And sort of in terms of to transition from there into like more of the process stuff, again, like this is sort of just recently changed that I've made the adjustment that I'm now on a 2-week publishing schedule. I sort of have backed my publishing schedule down over the last like year and a half or so. I was doing weekly for years, and then I switched to like 3 videos a month, and then I switched to like 2 on, 1 off. And the idea for those was to give myself at least an occasional research week because I was sort of running out of time to do research, and that was not great because that meant I had to make videos I didn't have to research, and I was running out of things that I didn't have to research. And so I sort of literally like a couple weeks ago as of this recording was just like, I'm going to switch to an every other week, just fully 2 weeks. And that way I have a full week to research and think about script writing and maybe write the script during that week, maybe not. And that's the week I'm in right now, is sort of trying to look at the song that I'm going to be making a video about next week and analyzing that a bit. But that gives me time to do the research and also to think about how I want to frame the ideas a bit more instead of just like going with my first like stream of conscious thought, which I was definitely doing a little bit by the end. But that way I have more time. And then usually, ideally around like Friday or Saturday, I'm going to record the audio for that. And I honestly, like, this is maybe not something I should be admitting in front of like a professional musician audience, but I just do my audio recording in Premiere. Like, I don't even have like a real DAW. I just record it straight into that. I think my computer has GarageBand if I really wanted to use GarageBand, but like Premiere has enough audio editing features and like I don't need anything super fancy, and so it just works.
Yeah.
And then it's right there when I transition and when I do the video editing as well.
Sure.
So once I do that and like put in all the like the musical examples, which when I'm playing those myself, I make those in Reason. I have Reason 8. When I'm doing like stems or whatever, I'll usually, if I'm playing around with those, I'll use Melodyne, which, standard industry tool stuff. But once I have that, I will go through and listen to the audio and write down animation directions effectively, like a list of things point by point what I want to draw. And that's honestly the most annoying part of the production process. So what I'll do is I'll set like a 20-minute timer and just do as much as I can, and then go take a break and come back later in the day and do another 20 minutes and do that. And usually I can get about 3 to 4 minutes of audio directed per 20-minute run. So on a video that's like 15 minutes, that's probably like 3 or 4 or 5 of those sessions. Yeah. And then, from there, I'll go and film, which is just literally like I sit down at my dining room table. I'm sitting underneath my camera. So I have a tripod that goes over my head, and it's sort of on chairs that have stacks of books and board games just to get the height.
I love it.
And then it's just pointing straight. The thing about doing YouTube is you don't have a production budget, so you just figure out whatever works.
Yeah.
Again, we were talking before we started recording. Right now, my mic is just on a stack of textbooks.
I love that.
Yeah, it's just the wizard behind the screen. Don't pay attention to all that other stuff. It looks nice.
It all works. It all works, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And then from there, I'll like sit down and I just have my computer in front of me with the list, and I will just go down the list and draw things. And then one thing I've been asked a couple times, like, oh, do you plan out where everything goes on the page? And no, I don't. I just have my list, and in the list I will include occasionally just a thing that's like new page ? So that I know those are points where I can change pages without it just like being in the middle of a sentence or something, or being in the middle of a thought. And so that lets me organize, and it looks like I planned it a little bit, but I didn't.
It totally does. No, it totally does.
But yeah,
in fact, it didn't occur to me until you said it just now that you record the audio and then you record the video, because when you watch them, it looks like you're saying the thing and drawing it as you talk about it. And I'm still like super impressed, but in the moment was like, how do they do that?
Yeah.
So yeah, that's awesome.
Yeah, I've had a lot of people ask about the technique of that, and one thing that I like, because I had seen a couple other people do sort of similar things, and my assumption, and I think a lot of people's assumption, is that you just slow down the audio and record in time with that slowed down audio, or just draw in time with that audio.
Right.
But it turns out that isn't very effective. What winds up happening is that you have to rush some things, you have to drag other things, and everything just winds up looking sloppy. So instead, literally every time I finish a drawing, that is a separate cut that I'm doing. Like, I've sped it up to its own custom amount. Again, in Premiere, that's sort of the last step is once I have it filmed, I'll bring it into Premiere, and I line it up like, it's every like 2 to 3 seconds, or like when I'm notating, it's like every note. So, well, actually not every note. What I found is that for 16th notes, if you have a run of 4 16th notes, it actually looks wrong if I have each note drawn on the beat. So instead I'll draw the first and last one on the beat, and because the last one takes so much longer to draw than all the others, because you have to draw all of the beams and the stems, and God, I'm blanking on words, but you know how weird 4 16th notes looks, everyone. So it's just like, because there's so much more drawing that goes into that fourth one, you sort of have to fake it a little bit and bump the other and just do that. So that's highly technical detail I probably didn't need to include, but you know, going through these things, I will, like I said, just chop it up and like drag it with the rate stretch tool in Premiere. I used to, because I didn't know about the rate stretch, I used to do that manually by like looking at where the clip started, looking at where I wanted my hand to start pulling away, and then just going into the speed and duration thing and setting the duration to be exactly that many frames. And I was doing that again every like 2 to 3 seconds of video but then like a friend of mine told me about rate stretch, and it's so much easier. But yeah.
That's awesome. I don't think you're getting too technical, by the way.
No, it's really interesting. When you do the musical examples, I mean, they really are right in time. I hadn't thought about that until right now, but now that you said it, I'm like, yeah, they're right in time with the music. So, yeah, very cool.
And it's something that, like, as music theory teachers, and I know not all of our listeners are music theory teachers, I know that's fine, but for those of us that are, you know, in the year 2021, to be able to do some of these things is really a game changer for all of us. To be able to get a video out there that is really high quality, that's really informative, that's really clear, and has everything, you know, and to draw from your experience is just really valuable to all of us, and I hope it's valuable to everyone listening out there. That,
I hope so, yeah.
You know, I've certainly gone through like an evolution of a year and a half of like videos I've made, you know, and my videos are not even close to like some of the stuff you've done, you know, so I'm like trying to evolve, and I'm like trying to keep pushing the needle every time I make a video. So just hearing this, I think, is super, super helpful.
Cool. And you're learning as you're going, right? We're kind of figuring out the technology, and I think the beauty of your videos is that it looks effortless. Like, it looks so easy, but you know, you try to do that and it's like, wow, this is really challenging. And hearing you talk about it, the process shows how much work it takes to make something look simple, right?
Yeah, and there's definitely still, like, I'm still learning how to do this stuff too. I'm still figuring out, like, at this point, a lot of the technological stuff I've basically got figured out. I don't know that I could optimize that much more than I already have, but like trying to figure out like what I want to do with my with a pause, with if my hand's not in the shot for like particularly long, how I want to handle that, what I want to do if if a drawing goes wrong, or how I want to. There's a lot of things that I'm still sort of thinking about and figuring out and like iterating as I go, and so I mean that process never ends, you know.
Yeah. Can you talk a little bit about your style? Because I've been watching a lot of videos of yours over the past couple weeks. Oh, and I've seen many over the past years, and you have an incredibly consistent style.
Yeah.
I wasn't. Was there someone with like a different handed person at some
yes.
point? Okay.
Yes. No one knows about that. That's such deep 12-tone lore.
I wasn't sure if like your camera, you had a camera flipping thing at one point, but I'm like, I think 12-tone used to be right-handed or something like that.
Oh, go on. I didn't mean to.
And I guess the second question was like, why do you think your videos have been so successful? Obviously, they're unique. You know, you see the thumbnail or you watch the video. You're the only one that's doing that. But you know, the way you have the text and the kind of cartoon, that's almost like stream of consciousness, right? You kind of have these cartoons that look like you're just kind of doodling, right? What kind of responses have you had from your viewers on like what they really like about the way you deliver that music theory content?
Yeah. So first of all, since you mentioned it, I just want to shout out our original animator. His name is Emmanuel. He was in the same in the same program I was. Got his degree at the same time, and he for the first 6 months or so, I had recruited him because he just has much better handwriting than I do, and so it felt like that would be better for legibility. And it was great. He was working really well, and then about 6 months in, he decided to move out of LA, and you know that totally fair. Like the job wasn't paying him at that point. I can't be mad at him for bailing. But he, you know, and at that point it was either like, okay, I have to either stop making 12-tone, which I don't want to do, or start doing this myself, or find someone else to do it. But that seemed way more daunting than the other two options. So it's just like, I'm just going to do it myself. And I will eventually learn how to draw, hopefully. And I'm still waiting for that moment. But but yeah, as for the style, I think I often get people being like, oh, it's so unique, which is interesting to me, because to me it's completely ripped off of Minute Physics and Vi-Heart. The way I often describe my work when people ask is like, oh, I just saw Minute Physics and Vi-Heart, and I was like, oh, what if I did that but worse? And so that sort of, and obviously, to give myself a bit more credit, all three of our channels look very different, and there's very different approaches to the hand-drawn animation style. But I think the thing that draws people to them is the same stuff that drew me to Minute Physics and Vi-Heart in the first place, is that I've in the past almost described it as a garage rock aesthetic. If you listen to a band like the White Stripes, part of the point of that is that it doesn't sound like professionals, it sounds like extremely talented amateurs.
Yeah.
And obviously there's a lot of work that goes into making it sound like that. I'm not saying that they're actually amateurs, but that's sort of the vibe, and so it makes it feel more relatable. And so the fact that the tempo drifts, or the fact that the chords, his finger slid a little bit on the guitar and played a note he didn't mean to play, that's not a problem. It becomes a feature. It becomes something that makes it more connectable. You can sort of relate to it. And I think similarly with my work, I've built this aesthetic that is inherently very forgiving, which is, again,
sometimes
great
you cross things out, right?
Yeah, I'll draw something, or sometimes I'll just do a drawing and be like, that didn't work, but I'm too deep into a page to start over, so we're just gonna roll with it. And there's a lot of leeway in that, and a lot of humanity to it, I think, that makes it feel, because I think by and large across the board, anyone working in educational YouTube is going for one of two things. Anyone working successfully in educational YouTube, I should say, they're either going for super polished documentary style aesthetic, where it just looks like 100 people each spent 1,000 hours making this video, or they're going for the vibe of just being your friend, of sort of sitting in the room with you and walking you through an idea. And there are negative connotations to that if we want to get into the dangers of parasocial relationships, and that's a thing that at least those of us who are responsible about it tend to be careful about. But there's inherently, I think, to this an appeal to feeling like it's an actual human being just sitting down and talking with you casually, as opposed to, and like, no offense to present company, but as opposed to having like a college professor lecturing you.
No offense at all.
Very,
Yeah.
in terms of all in the YouTube marketplace, those sorts of lectures don't tend to do as well if there's not like a person to connect to. And that, I think, is a large part of what the drawings do, because like, if you look at someone like Adam Neely, like, he has his face in his video, and that makes it very easy to connect with him. And I love Adam, great dude, both on his work and like privately. Huge fan of that guy. But like, in my work, I didn't want to show my face.
Right.
And so I had to figure out other ways to make it feel like it was just like a friend explaining a thing to you. And that doodling style is a way to sort of feel like you're, to me, it immediately evokes like sitting in the back of a class you're not paying that much attention to and just messing around. Right. And if you go back to like early Vihart videos, for instance, they're literally called like doodling in math class. And the whole theme is like, she's talking about like ignoring the teacher and drawing these things, and they happen to wind up being the mathematical structure that the teacher was talking about. And it's a great bit, and that I think really emphasizes how this sort of thing works, and it makes it feel like you're just, sitting around goofing off, and I did that in some classes where I'd just sit in the back and doodle, like with a manual, actually. Like, we would sit in the back and draw, like, just mess around, and that sort of thing, I think, is very relatable to anyone who has ever not paid attention in class. And I think most people have at some point in their life not paid attention in class. And so that I think gives it, and again, it sort of removes some of the, for lack of a better word, stuffiness of it too. It makes it feel like it's sort of like an unspoken, like, look, I get it. Like, this may not seem like the most exciting thing, but trust me, I think it's really cool and you should listen to me. As opposed to like trying to be like really like, oh, you should care about this thing. It just has this subtlety to it that shows rather than tells that, like,
yes,
I acknowledge that maybe you might not think you care, but you should care.
So have you ever, there's a lot of, in the drawings, there's a lot of reoccurring themes. Ben, did we just do that thing we always do where we talk over each other? There's a lot of reoccurring themes in the drawings, like home often means tonic, the elephant shows up, the mouse, other things like that. Have you ever thought of creating like a legend of those, or do you have kind of your own legend maybe of those kind of pictures that show up over and over?
A little bit, and I've had like audience members talk about, like, either requested or some people have talked about just putting one together themselves. But like, I kind of like the freedom that not being really explicit about it gives me, because I can use the same thing for multiple different ideas, and I can sort of change things over time. And like, I do, like, one thing that I have on my computer, or on my Google Drive, let's be real, but one thing I have is just a list of like the drawings that I do for specific numbers, because like you'll get into a position where it's like, okay, how do I draw something to represent the concept of 16? And that's not a problem I have to solve that often, but when it comes up, like, it's hard. And so, like, for that one, I'd do like a minecart with coal to reference the 16 Tons song.
But
nice.
I think I just got that.
But yeah. Oh, that also brings back to another thing, is that, like, one thing that I rely on is that I do so many drawings, like, per minute or per video, that it really doesn't matter if people don't get any particular one. And so I can just sort of do, like, fun references for me sometimes, and just do things that I don't expect anyone to understand, or things that, like, someone might get but doesn't really get, or doesn't need to get. And, like, for instance, for the number 6, to go back to numbers, I draw a penny farthing bicycle, and I ran a Twitter poll at one point to ask if anyone got that. And, like, I think 90% of my audience was like, no, I have no idea what this is. But like the 10% who did realize that it was a reference to The Prisoner were like, oh, that's super cool. Like,
well, we do that in the classrooms all the time. I'm always saying these offhanded comments that only like the one student in the back gets, and everyone else like totally goes over their head. I love that you're doing the same thing with your YouTube audience. Now, thinking about teaching, and so kind of, I want to kind of talk about kind of more kind of philosophical things and how you see yourself and other YouTubers like yourself, Anna Neely, and folks. Like, do you think of yourself as a music theory teacher? And is your channel and the other online platforms that you participate with, like, kind of you see that as your classroom?
I think teacher is a loaded word. Like, I feel like that has too many associations that don't really match what I'm doing. I will describe myself as a music theory educator, but I don't know that teacher is accurate. And it's partly like, if one thing, like you're talking about, sort of like YouTube and my Twitter account, whatever, as a classroom, or especially YouTube, one of the big parts of a classroom is that there's interaction, right? Like you interact with your students interact with you. There's a whole conversation that goes there. And to extend the metaphor, I just have too many students for that to be plausible. And it's just like, if 20,000 people watch a video, I can't grade 20,000 people's homework. And usually more than 20,000 people watch, But just the scale that I'm working at has its benefits and its downsides. And I don't... This is the thing that gets talked about a lot in these sorts of... In like educational or YouTube educational circles, is like, are we a replacement for a college classroom? And I come down pretty definitively on the side of like, no. I would not recommend that someone who was considering getting a degree in music theory instead watch 300 12-tone videos. That is not going to be as useful. It's not going to do the same thing. It might be more effective at some parts of it, but it's going to be less effective at others, again, because of that interaction, because you lack sort of repetition, because there's all sorts of ways in which the YouTube as a platform doesn't really work as a substitute for a more traditional education. But on the other hand, I think what we're really good at is enthusiasm, is taking ideas and being like, here's why you should care. Here's why I care. And here's that I care. I think that's a thing that, like, I remember when I started taking theory in college, and we were doing 4-part writing, and at no point did I get any sense of why I should care about 4-part writing. I was talking to a friend of mine, and he was just like, well, I don't know, maybe if you want to write a string part for your metal song at some point, this might be useful. It's like, yeah, that's about as good a use as I can think of for this thing that we're dedicating 8 quarters to. When
your metal band is backed up by the San Francisco Orchestra, like Metallica,
you never know. You're Evanescence did it.
Well, I think that's a really interesting point, because if you're teaching in a classroom, you have a captive audience.
Yeah.
Right? They're not going to go anywhere for the next 50 minutes. Yeah. But as someone who's creating videos on YouTube,
we have the exact opposite, whatever that is.
Right.
This is a thing I think that's a great point. We have, you have people who have chosen to be there at some level. Maybe they don't necessarily want to take theory, but they've chosen to get a music degree or whatever. They have external motivation to care because they have to get a good grade. They have to keep their GPA up for if they care about that, or if they need to care about that. But I have none of that. Instead, what I have is a sidebar of videos that YouTube thinks you might be more interested in than the one you're currently watching.
And you have to make an impression. I mean, that's what they're called, right? Impressions. And so you want to make a good one.
Literally fighting for your attention every minute. And, that's not to say that, in a classroom, every student is always paying attention. But they're very limited in the set of things they can go do otherwise, compared to, my audience, who can go do literally anything. They could close the window. They could go for a walk. I wouldn't know.
Yeah.
Well, it's true that the feedback matters too. So in my classroom, I have relatively small class sizes. I'm lucky that way. And I'm probably going to notice if a student isn't really paying attention, and I might call on them or, say, isn't that right? So-and-so, as I'm going on to try and pull them back in and get them back involved. So, yeah.
Yeah. For sure.
Yeah, and so you see where on YouTube where you have your peak views, right, and things where tail off. Do you ever look at those analytics and make changes because of that?
So over the last couple years, I've made an active effort to not, and that's largely because I was finding that like YouTube gives you so many numbers, and it's so easy to convince yourself that those numbers have meaning. That like I found myself really like spiraling into like depressive episodes when videos didn't perform or when something went wrong. And even when they were doing well, I was just like spending like hours sitting in analytics looking at like what's happening, what's going on, and it's just like was not good for my mental health. And so I made an active effort. I actually like installed a browser extension called StyleBot that I use to hide all view counts and all analytic data across the platform. And I can turn it off and I can look at the numbers if I want to, but I can't suddenly like load a page and get like hit with like, oh, this video has this many views. And like even like other people's videos, I was finding like once I was not looking at mine, I was looking at like my friends, and if their video was getting like 150,000 views, there's a part of the voice in the back of my head that's like, that's way better than you usually do. Like, what's wrong with your It's just like trying to step back and refocus on making what I wanted to make and what felt meaningful and important to me was going to be much more useful. Because, like, more than anything, being a professional YouTuber is a game of longevity. It's so much more than anything else. So much more than like knowing how to make a thumbnail, knowing how to like whatever. It's about continuing to make stuff long term. And so as someone, if I want to continue doing this indefinitely, which I don't know if I do, I'm like, that's still a question. But like for now, that's my current plan. But like if that's something I want, then I have to set it up so that I still feel good about it a year from now, 10 years from now, 10 years. That would be a long time to make YouTube videos. But
and you brought up so many good points there, yeah.
But yeah, no, it's just like the one thing I do is I'll do like a quarterly review where I'll go look at like, okay, for the last 3 months, how did my videos do? And that way I'm aware if something is going like super wrong. And the other thing I'll do sometimes is I'll like sort my videos by like views and just look at what my top 30 most viewed videos ever are. And that can give me some context of what people are responding to, and I can notice if like a new video has gotten there. But any particular new video probably won't at this point, because that's less than 10% of all my videos. And so I'm not like bummed out if I like look like a week after a video's gone up and be like, oh, it's not in my top 30 ever, because I don't expect it to be. And so that gives me some context. And again, the quarterly reviews give me some more information as well about the overall direction of the channel. But I try really hard to not dig too deep into the numbers because it just stresses me out.
Yeah.
That makes perfect sense. That would be like if we were receiving course evaluations after every lecture.
Yep.
And then also able to see
during
everyone
every
else's,
lecture.
Yeah, exactly. Also able to see everyone else's course evaluations during every lecture. That would be terrible.
Yeah.
I know.
It's
I
bad
can't tell you
enough
the
getting
number.
them twice a year. Yeah.
So many times I've gone back into my office and been like, that lesson was a piece of crap. Like, what just happened?
Yeah.
You know, and I'll go back and I'll completely redo the whole thing, like just in the moment. And it's just, it must be like times 10 or times 100.
Yeah.
You know, when you have a published version of this on the internet, then you know, even when you have a dedicated following, it's like, well, that's great. But that at the same time, you have people that you know are going to be watching, you know, and that to me would just be the scariest thing ever. So like, kudos to you for just having that vulnerability. That resilience to fight the good fight and keep putting really good content out there. We all thank you for it. I think
thank you.
Us theorists that are in the academy. So happy to team up.
Yeah, who do you find watches your videos? I know you have more viewers than you could possibly know, but do you find are they music students? Are they hobbyists? Professionals? I'm sure you have some trolls in there too. But who do you find that kind of, at least I guess, watches and engages, right? Because most people just watch and don't comment or don't do anything. But of those who you've engaged with, who are these viewers?
Yeah, so if I'm looking at, and these days I don't read my comment section for similar reasons to the analytics. What I'll do is I'll get feedback on Twitter and through my community Discord, which I've found generally that if people have to go off-site to send you a message, their message is probably going to be more worth reading.
Sure.
And more interesting, and like less likely to just be like pointlessly negative, or even just like, one of the things that's like often hard to explain about like having like this large of an audience and this like, and again, like I don't even have that large of an audience by YouTube standards, but like, even having like tens of thousands of views, like you get so many people who leave like comments that are just like good video, and it's just over time you get so numb to the positivity of it, and it just winds up getting in the way of trying to find someone who's saying like something that actually adds anything. And so like I'm not saying don't leave those comments, like again, I'm not reading my comment sections anyway, so leave whatever you want, but it's one of those things where it's hard to convey just how numb you get to that sort of positive feedback without sounding kind of like a jerk.
Your fans, the masses, yes, their platitudes.
But it is one of those, like, again, like when I look at like my Twitter platform, people who engage on there and people who engage in my Discord, it's actually kind of different. Like on Twitter, like I'm connected to a lot of like music academics, a lot of people who like teach music theory or are in grad school for music theory, and that's really great. And those are people whose opinions I'm often like really nervous about, because, you know, like if I put out a video and someone I've never heard of, who I have no idea what their qualifications are, is just like, this is a bad analysis, then I'm like, well, I don't know if you know how to do that. But if I have like music theory professors being like, you screwed this one up, then it's just like, okay, well, I probably punted that. But on my like Discord, I find a lot of hobbyists, a lot of people who make music, but either did a degree and decided to go like do the performing thing, or a lot of people who either bounced off the academy because it didn't work for them, or never tried in the first place. But people who are like really interested in these sorts of approaches to music without necessarily wanting to go through the whole path of becoming an academic music theorist. And because, you know, one of the things, like, you see a lot of like this in tuning theory. There's a lot of like tuning theory hobbyists out there who just love playing with synths, and that's great. And it means you have this whole community that's like not entirely disconnected from the academy, obviously, but like a lot of them aren't particularly tied to traditional academic roots. And so when I do videos about tuning theory, I get all these people coming out who like have a lot of thoughts about this and have never really had like a big public platform to share them on, or anyone to like talk to. And so I really appreciate that. And it's been really cool to sort of connect with people who like thinking about music in the same ways that I do, and maybe that made them not quite as good a fit for going a traditional academic route.
Sure.
So, yeah.
Yep.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Yeah. Well, I think what you're doing is great. And this has been such a fun conversation to have, to get a little bit behind the scenes, and see more than your hand and arm has been great as well. But before we kind of sign off, we like to do just a short little rapid fire kind of series. And so this is where you can throw out your Twitter clickbait, sound bites, things like that. And so, Jen, Ben, do you have an idea? I have one.
I have one.
Okay, Jen.
And we don't talk about these, so we don't know each other. So hopefully we won't steal.
I have a new one. So, Jen, do you want to go first?
I do too. Well, I was going to ask, what are your top 3 channels that you're following right now on YouTube?
Oh, music specifically, or
anything you want?
Yeah. Laura Crone is phenomenal. She does videos mostly about movies, but from a really sort of interesting philosophical perspective. Highly recommend her work. Neurotransmissions is a channel about neuroscience. They're great. They're like good friends of mine as well. I've known them for years. And one that I've been sort of watching recently that is a fairly recent channel, but is actually about music, to get one of those in there, is Sounds Good. She does things about mostly like electronic and experimental music. And it's been really interesting to learn a bit more about that, because that's not an area that I'm super tied into. So
That's great. That's great. Yeah. All right. Mine is, I'm going to give it to you in a song. All right. So here we go. So, music theory. Huh. What is it good for?
It's a complicated question. I think that
soundbite here. Thinking soundbite.
I don't view that as being one specific use, but the thing that appeals to me about it is God, it's tough to soundbite.
That's good. You can philosophize. Go on a tangent.
I think the main thing that music theory does for me is it helps me more deeply understand musical nuances in the works that I appreciate and enjoy. Like, it helps me put a deeper understanding on what specifically is working for me than just pointing at a thing and be like, oh, this is that. And I think that, the main thing is, like, I often see people like arguing that like the main point of music theory is to help you write better songs, and I really don't like that idea. I think that that's it does help you write better songs, but I don't like the idea that that's the primary purpose, and I tend to view it. Right. Okay, so let me give you a soundbite here, because I just remembered. I will have often said that I believe the thoughtful, thorough analysis of art is itself art. And so first and foremost, to me, music theory is an art form. There's a soundbite.
That's a soundbite. There you go. I love that. Well, and I think you're right on with, you don't have to know music theory to be a songwriter. I was watching 3-2-1 McCartney on Hulu. It's with Paul McCartney and Rick Rubin talking. And one of the episodes, he's playing guitar and he's talking about his song Michelle, and he plays the secondary dominant. He's like, I don't even know what this chord is. I don't know, but it sounds good. And it works great. And he doesn't know the name of that. He doesn't know how it functions, but he knows what sounds good and how it works.
And he doesn't need to.
Right.
He does it internally, right? He doesn't have to know the name.
Yeah, and that's getting into sort of the sort of implicit versus explicit knowledge. He definitely knows what that chord is. He just doesn't know what to call it.
Right.
Yeah, I love that. Mine has to do with kind of something you talked about earlier, which is kind of including different groups, that when you came up in your undergrad, there were a lot of groups that you were interested in, but your professors didn't even mention. Yeah. So what is the number one artist or group that we need to be mentioning in our classes every week?
Oh, God. That's a tough one. Honestly, it's one of those things where I think the artist that comes to mind that I think should be discussed a lot more in music, like academia in general, is Kendrick Lamar. I'm not sure that I would necessarily try and just shoehorn a discussion of Kendrick Lamar into a traditional theory curriculum and call it good.
Right.
And so if I was doing, like, trying to fit something that fit with that mold already a bit better, I might say someone like Nirvana. But I do think specifically hip-hop needs a lot more academic respect and academic exploration. And definitely. I think Kendrick is a perfect place to do a lot of that.
Well, that comes up in your video about, like, why Beethoven sucks or something like that. That's the gist of the title, but the idea
Beethoven
is...
sucks at music,
Yes, there it is. But the idea is that, of course we have the canon, and are those really the people... Because your point in that video is not that no one should like Beethoven, but more that Like, why is it people who barely know anything written by Beethoven would list him among the best composers to ever live, right? And it's because of our cultural, And of course, Kendrick Lamar, there's the whole outrage when he wins the Pulitzer.
Yeah. But I think, so the general thesis of that video is that I should be allowed to not like Beethoven. Mm-hmm. It's not that I don't like Beethoven either. I don't have strong opinions about Beethoven one way or the other. But like there's like you said, this cultural expectation that even if I've never listened to a Beethoven piece, I should be like, oh yeah, Beethoven is one of the greatest composers of all time, definitely. And
right. And I think one of the themes of our podcast, this will end up being early in season 2, but if we had a theme for season 1, it would be we're all revising our curriculum to be much broader and much more inclusive. And I think actually I can think of lots of ways that I can fit hip-hop artists and Kendrick Lamar into my class the way it exists right now, because we don't touch figured bass until they're almost at the end of a 4-semester sequence. We don't do part writing until they're in theory 2, and half of theory 2 is pop music now. So we're trying.
And to be fair, I haven't taken a theory class in almost a decade now, so I don't really know what those look like these days, but
I think a lot of people are trying.
I definitely think so.
Reimagine it.
I think
for the music
in a lot of ways
world
we are at
now.
sort of a flashpoint for the field where there's sort of really been a reckoning around the way we talk about the canon and the way we talk about non-canonic music.
Yeah,
and I think that's great. And I hope that continues.
Yeah, same.
Yeah, absolutely. And I love to pick up an artist here or there that I may not know and start with the artists themselves. I think that's a good way to do it as well.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah. So as we're wrapping up, tell us a little bit about what you have going on into the future. Of course, I guess YouTube for another 10 years at least.
Yeah,
at least. And if people are discovering you for the first time, where can they learn more about you? Where can they find you on the internet?
Yeah, so mostly my biggest platform is by a wide margin YouTube. I'm also fairly active on Twitter, twitter.com/12tonevideos. And I also have my own podcast as well called Ghost Notes.
It's really good. I've been listening to that too. It's great.
Thank you. It is technically produced by a platform called Nebula. So they get episodes a month early, but then they all go live everywhere that podcasts are normally available after a month. So, they are totally freely available. I just have to plug Nebula. So
that's our show. Thank you so much for listening to Note Doctors, the Music Theory and Pedagogy podcast. We will be back with more interviews with professors and teachers who will be dropping all sorts of theory knowledge for your education, edification, and enjoyment. So until then, bye-bye.